No one in the world was ever supposed to uncover this deeply suppressed nightmare. It safely remained hidden beneath 2 long centuries of gathering dust, intentional denial, and willful ignorance. A dark story possessing such immense toxicity that the earth instinctively refused to hold its terrifying weight. During the oppressive, humid morning of mid-August 1843, a piercingly agonized scream ruptured the stagnant air blanketing the Willowbrook plantation. This terrifying sound resonated with clear suffering that immediately stopped the songs of birds resting in the oak trees. However, the momentary auditory disturbance did not guarantee the apocalyptic destruction of this established southern county. Rather, the terrifyingly absolute stillness that followed fundamentally sealed their inescapable fate. It introduced the calculatingly cold, breathtakingly deliberate, and disturbingly calm mind of a prominent woman witnessing a reality-shattering truth. A forbidden truth remaining perfectly obscured for centuries until this exact moment. How could a profoundly monstrous, institutionalized punishment evaporate from authenticated public archives? What specific details were deliberately excised from those permanently sealed courthouse documentation boxes? The true explanation proves substantially more catastrophic than any speculative community whispering. It begins not through straightforward marital infidelity, but alongside the paralyzing realization that humanity's most destructive weapon remains a systematically devastated woman possessing absolutely nothing whatsoever remaining to lose. Before that fateful August morning, Catherine Hargrove represented the absolute pinnacle of Southern perfection. She stood very proudly as the esteemed mistress of 3,000 sprawling acres of prime South Carolina agricultural land, residing within a majestic mansion featuring grand columns as stark white as bleached bone. Her wealthy husband, Edmund, perfectly embodied the traditional visual image of a respectable gentleman planter. He was a tall, distinguished, and highly respected figure, serving faithfully as a dedicated deacon at their local community church. Edmund was a powerful man whose entire world was meticulously built upon strict order, unwavering tradition, and the silent, unyielding, backbreaking labor of the enslaved individuals who worked his massive estate. However, Catherine's seemingly perfect world was actually nothing more than an oppressive, gilded cage, and its unyielding bars were forged entirely from the cruel, hushed whispers of her peers. After 6 long years of formal marriage, the couple remained completely childless. Within the elite, judgmental parlors of Beaufort society, this agonizing fact became her only truly defining characteristic. She was viewed simply as a barren wife and a profound, inescapable failure. She constantly saw this harsh judgment reflected in the pitying, condescending glances of other wealthy women constantly surrounding her. She deeply felt it in the cold, unbridgeable emotional distance that permanently defined her husband's marital bed. Edmund served as a perfectly dutiful, albeit completely remote, romantic partner. He executed his expected societal role with the exact same measured, calculated efficiency he regularly utilized to meticulously manage his complex financial ledgers. He was undoubtedly considered a steadfast pillar of their local community, but during the quiet, solitary moments of their shared existence, specifically in the haunting space lingering between heartbeats late at night, Catherine felt a profound, suffocating emptiness echoing throughout her massive home. She consistently noticed a chilling hollowness residing deep within her husband's guarded eyes. It was a dark, unspoken secret he kept securely locked away from her view. Catherine, comfortably wrapped in her own carefully constructed layers of psychological denial, had desperately convinced herself it was simply a meaningless secret that did not truly matter in the grand scheme of their wealthy lives. But toxic secrets, much like a rapidly spreading rot, always possess a highly terrifying, undeniable way of expanding outward. They slowly poison the surrounding air and subtly alter the very taste of the drawing water. Catherine, a deeply observant woman extensively trained to notice every subtle, minuscule shift within the fragile ecosystem of her grand household. She had slowly begun to notice the small, undeniably dissonant notes playing within the otherwise predictable symphony of their sprawling plantation life. She had no exact name at all for this shadow, but she strongly felt it. This terrifying invisible shadow, slowly lingering just behind the sun-drenched, picturesque facade of Willowbrook, eventually revealed its specific names: Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel. These exceptional individuals were not merely considered legal property within the cruel confines of this southern world. They were actual living men who actively moved through Edmund Hargrove's expansive personal orbit in a unique way that absolutely no one else did. Marcus, serving as his personal valet, was 24 years old, possessing a remarkably light-skinned complexion, along with a sharp, undeniable intelligence that functioned simultaneously as a rare gift and a devastating curse. He constantly anticipated Edmund's particular needs long before they were ever verbally spoken aloud, maintaining a silent, graceful, and ever-present shadow in the main house. However, his highly observant eyes held a tense, coiled attention, a hidden, unspoken knowledge that firmly set him apart from the rest of the household staff. He undeniably knew the powerful master in a profoundly intimate way that Catherine never possibly could. Samuel only strictly worked the outer horse stables. He was 26, physically imposing, and possessing incredibly strong, capable hands that could instantly calm a raging, terrified stallion or meticulously mend a broken leather harness in mere minutes. He maintained a quiet, unbreakable dignity that the cruel institution of slavery had somehow never managed to fully crush or extinguish. Furthermore, Edmund had developed a highly unusual particular interest in the horse stables over the past several years, constantly visiting the area at incredibly odd hours, long after the heavy, exhausting daily work was officially declared finished. Then there was young Daniel, the incredibly talented plantation carpenter who was barely 21 years old. He possessed a slight, almost fragile physical build, matched beautifully with a true artist's delicate, nimble hands. He was undoubtedly the quietest, most unassuming individual of the entire trio, a deeply cautious man who had painfully learned that his personal survival fundamentally relied entirely upon his complete invisibility. But Edmund clearly saw him. In fact, Edmund clearly saw every single one of them. For 3 long, uninterrupted years, Edmund had meticulously cultivated an entirely separate, secret secondary life concealed deep within the sprawling east wing of the Grand Mansion. This specific wing was officially designated as entirely closed for supposed extensive structural building renovations. These supposed renovations miraculously never seemed to show any actual physical progress. It featured its own private, isolated entrance, perfectly hidden from prying eyes by a thick, overgrown tangle of fragrant, blooming jasmine vines that completely swallowed the surrounding brickwork. This clever, natural botanical camouflage ensured his nighttime movements remained totally unseen by all. Inside of this dark, hidden sanctuary, he had purposefully furnished a small private room. It was not decorated lavishly, but rather with a profound, undeniable sense of comforting permanence. It contained a massive wooden bed, meticulously dressed with expensive fine linens that Catherine had previously noted as completely missing from the official household laundry inventory. Heavy, impenetrable velvet curtains securely blocked out the harsh, judgmental gaze of the pale moonlight, and a thick, heavy iron lock secured the heavy wooden door from the inside. This hidden chamber was his true sanctuary, representing his only actual authentic home in the entire world. Here, underneath the soft, flickering golden glow of burning oil lamps, the incredibly crushing, constant performance of acting as Edmund Hargrove, the ruthless plantation master, could finally, mercifully cease. Here, he was permitted to be something else entirely. But one must deeply question what exactly happens when a supposed peaceful sanctuary is actually built. It was fundamentally built upon an unyielding, solid foundation of absolute, terrifying power. These 3 enslaved men truly possessed zero actual choice in this dangerous matter. Can you even begin to try and comprehend the sheer, absolute terror of such a dynamic? To be summoned by the man who legally owns your body and controls your existence, knowing deeply that refusal is never an actual, survivable option for you. An outright verbal refusal meant facing the agonizing, skin-tearing cruelty of the overseer's whip. It instantly guaranteed a horrifying one-way trip straight to the unforgiving public auction block. It ultimately meant being violently sold down the dark, treacherous river, permanently torn away from the only loving family and familiar community you had ever known in your entire tragic life. Consequently, they reluctantly complied with his unthinkable demands. They obediently arrived whenever they were secretly called upon by the master. They meticulously kept his terrifying, world-shattering secret hidden deep within their chests. And in direct exchange for their continued silence and forced submission, they quietly received a handful of small, highly calculated mercies. They were given significantly better, more nourishing daily food rations, assigned noticeably lighter physical workloads around the sprawling estate, and provided a protective, invisible shield against the horrific daily brutality. This shield protected them from the casual violence commonly inflicted upon the countless field laborers. It was undeniably a sickening, twisted devil's bargain. It formed an incredibly complex, inescapable web woven tightly from absolute physical coercion, desperate human survival instincts, and perhaps something else entirely that defied logical explanation. A hushed, terrified, whispered rumor persisting heavily from that dark historical era, spoken exclusively by the enslaved community and absolutely never uttered by the arrogant masters, boldly claimed that the devil did not actually reside down in the fiery pits of hell, but rather thrived perfectly within the unspoken space existing between a wealthy man's public face and his twisted, dark private desires. For the deeply isolated Catherine, that particular dark, gaping space had gradually grown into an insurmountable, terrifying chasm that threatened to swallow her whole. The small, previously ignored daily inconsistencies had relentlessly started to stack up around her, slowly forming an undeniable, chilling pattern she could simply no longer pretend to ignore. Edmund was acting suddenly energized, appearing almost inexplicably cheerful and light on his feet after enduring long, grueling weeks of his usual brooding, icy emotional distance. Marcus was noticeably avoiding her direct, inquiring gaze whenever they repeatedly crossed paths in the very long, shadowed residential hallway. His entire physical body was tightly coiled with a strange, nervous tension she utterly failed to comprehend. Meanwhile, Daniel had recently developed a faint, distinct finger-shaped purple bruise pressing against his delicate neck, which he awkwardly attempted to hide beneath his stiff linen collar. Catherine had far too repeatedly pushed all of these glaring warning signs away, utterly refusing to confront the mounting visual evidence. Of course, for a proper Southern lady to even briefly consider the horrifying, unthinkable alternative was essentially to invite pure, unadulterated madness into her fragile mind. It was widely considered completely impossible, utterly unnatural, and fundamentally categorized as a moral sin so intensely profound that it was rarely ever spoken aloud or even given a proper name in polite society. The rigidly structured, morally inflexible world of a wealthy Southern gentleman absolutely did not and could not contain such vile, unspeakable filth. Her carefully educated mind, heavily trained exclusively in the delicate, polite feminine arts of watercolor painting and conversational French, aggressively refused to physically form the devastating words. But her desperate, aching heart, tragically starved of any genuine affection for 6 agonizing years and constantly battered by the quiet, unrelenting judgment of her social peers, intrinsically knew that something was deeply wrong. She absolutely, fundamentally, and irreparably knew something was severely broken within her household. The massive, carefully maintained wall of psychological denial was finally starting to crack under the immense, crushing weight of reality. The elaborate, suffocating lie she was currently living inside had simply become far too dangerously thin for her fragile spirit to continue to safely bear. The fateful, heavy night of August 11th, 1843, was completely starless, bringing a thick, oppressive heat that promised a looming storm. The stagnant, humid air sweeping across the sprawling plantation grounds was incredibly thick with the overwhelming, sickly sweet scent of blooming magnolia flowers, heavily mixed with a faint undertone of swamp decay. It was a highly distinct, unforgettable sensory combination that Catherine would forever permanently associate with the brutal, violent death of her entire sheltered world. On this specific, fateful night, she fiercely resolved that she would absolutely not lie submissively in her marital bed, aimlessly listening to the massive, empty house slowly settle around her in the dark. Tonight, She adamantly refused to continue to play the pathetic, ignorant role of the oblivious wife. She had finally made an unbreakable, monumental decision that would irreversibly alter the absolute, terrifying course of documented Southern plantation history forever. She vehemently resolved she would inevitably uncover the hidden truth, absolutely regardless of whatever horrifying reality it might finally reveal to her isolated existence. She deliberately intended to follow this pervasive, suffocating shadow directly back to its original putrid source. She wanted to clearly see with her own two eyes the specific, terrifying entity that had ruthlessly stolen her lawful husband and completely destroyed her expected future. She possessed absolutely no idea that what she was inevitably about to personally discover was not merely the tragic conclusion of her failing marriage, but rather the explosive beginning of a calculated vengeance so completely total that it would rapidly transform into a chilling ghost story whispered quietly for countless generations. She was undeniably no longer functioning simply as a neglected wife. She was rapidly metamorphosing into a relentless hunter, and her designated prey was the unvarnished, brutal truth. Whatever the ultimate cost might be, she was fully prepared to violently drag it out into the harsh, unforgiving light of day. She patiently waited in the suffocating darkness. She lay entirely motionless upon her large marital bed, remaining fully dressed underneath the heavy woven covers, her stiff body forming a rigid, unyielding line of anxious anticipation. The massive, historic house constantly groaned and shifted around her, each solitary creak of the aging floorboards serving as a maddening, agonizing countdown. Finally, she clearly heard it. The soft, deliberate tread of Edmund's heavy leather boots echoing faintly down the long hallway, moving purposefully not toward her lonely bedroom, but instead steadily toward the narrow servants' stairs. He was obviously trying desperately to remain completely silent, but in a massive house that essentially held its breath, every single isolated sound was significantly amplified to her highly attuned ears. She generously gave him 10 agonizing minutes, a perceived eternity of waiting, providing enough time for him to feel completely secure in his deception, to fully shed the oppressive skin of Edmund Hargrove, and seamlessly become whoever he truly was inside that locked, hidden room. Then she silently rose from her bed, wrapping a dark, woven shawl tightly over her stark, white linen nightgown, appearing much like a vengeful ghost moving soundlessly through the familiar corridors of her own corrupted home. Her bare feet made absolutely no discernible noise against the cool, heart-pine wooden floors. The expansive outdoor garden was a confusing, overgrown labyrinth of dark, twisted shadows, the pale quarter moon offering just barely enough illumination to safely navigate the winding dirt path. The humid night air was incredibly alive with the constant, deafening thrumming of hidden cicadas, a relentless, overwhelming sound that closely resembled 1,000 tiny, completely frayed human nerves vibrating all at once. Her own racing heart was beating frantically against her fragile ribs, pounding so incredibly loud she was entirely certain it would immediately wake the dead. She cautiously reached the remote east wing, immediately noticing the stagnant air suddenly felt intensely colder in this forbidden section. The heavy wooden side door, the specific one cleverly hidden behind the cascading jasmine vines, was left slightly ajar. A very thin sliver of warm, flickering lantern light escaped into the darkness, painting a constantly shifting golden line directly upon the damp, exposed earth. She crept significantly closer to the opening, her uneven breath painfully catching deep within her constricted throat, her slender hands trembling so violently she physically had to press them flat against the cold, damp brick of the exterior wall to steady herself. She carefully peered straight through the narrow gap, and her entire understanding of the known world permanently fractured. The secret room was exactly as she had previously suspected, but never dared to fully imagine. It was highly comfortable and undeniably lived in. The massive bed entirely dominated the small space, its exceptionally fine white linens standing in stark, shocking contrast against the dark mahogany wood. And lying upon that bed was her lawful husband, Edmund, completely unclothed, his bare body appearing like a pale, classical marble sculpture, illuminated softly in the gentle lamplight. But he was undeniably not alone. He was intimately entangled in a confusing, shifting mass of limbs alongside the 3 other familiar men. Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel were all fully present in the hidden chamber. The shocking scene unfolding before her wide eyes was not inherently violent, nor was it forced or coerced in any recognizable manner. What completely and utterly shattered Catherine to her very foundational core was the undeniable, sickening intimacy on display. She observed the casual, incredibly practiced and fluid way they all moved together in the warm light. She watched in sheer, unadulterated horror as Edmund gently kissed Marcus with a profound, lingering tenderness he had never, not even a single time, directed toward her during their entire marriage. She silently witnessed Samuel's strong, capable hands smoothly trace the long line of Edmund's bare back, with a relaxed familiarity that loudly spoke of countless previous nights occurring exactly like this particular one. She faintly heard young Daniel lean in and whisper something completely unintelligible directly into Edmund's ear, causing Edmund to throw his head back and loudly laugh. It was a remarkably genuine, completely unguarded, and deeply joyful sound. It was an authentic, emotional sound she had not personally heard him make in several long, miserable years. In that single, eternal, and completely devastating moment, Catherine perfectly and entirely understood the absolute truth. It was absolutely not just about the forbidden physical act itself. It was significantly deeper than the simple, agonizing sting of personal betrayal. The crushing realization was that he was genuinely happy in that room. He had successfully found his true joy, his authentic identity, his desired connection, and none of it had absolutely anything to do with her existence. She was the actual, fabricated lie. Their prestigious marriage, her entire life, her entire structured existence at the sprawling Willowbrook plantation was merely a carefully constructed, elaborate fictional narrative designed specifically to conceal this terrifying truth. Something deep inside her fragile mind did not simply break or fracture. It instantaneously flash-froze. It rapidly transformed from wounded, bleeding flesh into something incredibly sharp, beautifully crystalline, and dangerously cold. The frantic, agonizing scream that had instinctively risen high in her tight throat abruptly died out, swiftly replaced by a suffocating silence so intensely profound it felt as if the entire physical world had permanently gone deaf. The initial shock, the public humiliation, the raw, searing betrayal, it was all certainly present. But lurking darkly beneath those expected feminine reactions, an entirely new, deeply terrifying emotion was being violently born inside her heart. It was a focused rage so incredibly pure, it felt serene. For 6 agonizing years, she had obediently played her expected societal part. She had been the perfectly compliant wife, the tragically barren wife. She had quietly endured the condescending pity, the silent judgment, and the slow, painful erosion of her own personal self-worth. She had constantly blamed her own inadequate body and her perceived feminine failings, and all the while, he had been secretly living this entirely separate, authentic life inside this locked, hidden room alongside these enslaved men. The terrifying realization violently struck her mind with the immense, staggering force of a direct physical blow. In 1843 South Carolina, the shocking scene she was currently witnessing was not merely categorized as a severe moral sin. It was a severe, unforgivable criminal act strictly punishable by death, not just for the wealthy Edmund, but equally for the 3 vulnerable enslaved men willingly participating alongside him. The rigid, unforgiving state law, in its brutal and absolute simplicity, officially labeled it an unspeakable abomination, a definitive capital offense. The harsh legal system made absolutely no special moral distinction for a powerful, wealthy man of substantial property. It offered zero leniency or mercy. And in that frozen, terrible, reality-altering moment, quietly watching her husband's secret, joyous existence, Catherine Hargrove clearly saw her true path. It was absolutely not a peaceful path of expected feminine grief or potential marital reconciliation. It was a dark, treacherous path leading directly toward utter, biblical destruction and total ruin. She slowly backed away from the slightly open wooden door, her physical movements now incredibly precise, calculated, and deliberate. She seemingly floated back through the dark, overgrown garden path, the deafening cicadas now sounding remarkably like a terrifying choir of vengeful furies cheering her forward. She absolutely did not return to her cold, empty marital bed. Instead, she walked directly to her ornate wooden writing desk. Her delicate hands, which had been violently trembling in sheer terror mere moments before, were now perfectly, terrifyingly steady and resolute. She calmly lit a single slender wax candle, its small orange flame barely flickering in the completely still, stagnant room air. She purposefully pulled out her most expensive, heavy parchment stationery, the specific high-quality paper strictly reserved for her most vital official correspondence. The chaotic, burning rage had entirely evaporated from her system, seamlessly replaced by something infinitely more dangerous and unpredictable, absolute, unwavering purpose. She methodically began to write 3 separate, highly detailed, and completely devastating letters that would irreversibly destroy multiple lives. She composed one letter to Edmund's overbearing mother, the powerful family matriarch whose constant bitter disappointment had relentlessly haunted Catherine for many years. She wrote another to the stern Sheriff Charles Dunwoody, a rigid, inflexible man who aggressively valued established social order and absolute adherence to the law above all other earthly concerns. And she crafted one final, surprisingly brief letter directly to Edmund himself. In every single letter, she meticulously described exactly what she had witnessed in the East Wing. She absolutely spared no scandalous, explicit detail. She expertly utilized her carefully chosen words as incredibly sharp, lethal weapons, deliberately crafting a horrifying portrait of absolute depravity so incredibly vivid, so completely undeniable, that absolutely no one reading it could ever possibly view Edmund Hargrove as anything other than a vile, unnatural monster. She aggressively sealed each completed letter with dripping red wax, violently pressing her prestigious family's heavy metal signet ring into it with a final, definitive, echoing thud. She quietly walked down the hall to Edmund's bedroom and effortlessly slid his specific letter underneath the heavy wooden door. Then she calmly returned to her own room, peacefully lay on top of the covers, still fully dressed in her dark shawl and nightgown, and patiently waited for the inevitable sun to rise. She was definitively no longer Catherine Hargrove, the pathetic, tragically wronged and barren wife. She was rapidly transforming into an unstoppable, merciless angel of total vengeance, and the impending bloody dawn was swiftly approaching to quietly watch her horrific work begin. A powerful, wealthy man's public reputation is considered the exclusive property of others, but his true inner character remains entirely his own. This specific, well-known quote, frequently attributed to a famous Charleston philosopher of that rigid era, served as the completely unspoken foundational creed governing Edmund's privileged world. Your hidden, personal character could theoretically be absolutely anything you desired, strictly as long as your outward public reputation remained completely pristine and aggressively untarnished. Edmund finally discovered the sealed letter just as the very first pale grey light of the impending dawn slowly bled through his bedroom window glass. It was lying innocently on the floor, a crisp, perfectly white rectangle standing in stark, glaring contrast against the dark wooden floorboards, the thick red wax seal looking disturbingly like a fresh, bright drop of spilled blood. He nervously broke the heavy seal. He quickly read the terrifying, impossible words, and the warm blood instantly and completely drained from his pale, profoundly shocked face. The expensive paper violently shook within his trembling, unsteady hand. He desperately read the damning contents again, and then slowly a third agonizing time, clinging to a desperate, entirely nonsensical and childish hope that the harsh ink might magically change, somehow rearranging itself into something significantly less catastrophic to his existence. She intimately knows absolutely everything. The horrifying thought served as an immediate, deafening death knell tolling inside his spinning head. She personally witnessed everything in the room, and she has incredibly already dispatched the detailed letters directly to the unforgiving sheriff and to my strict mother. His previously ordered, highly structured mind instantly splintered into 1,000 chaotic, panicked, and racing thoughts. He could frantically attempt to run away. He could quickly saddle his fastest horse, ride desperately toward the northern borders, and attempt to completely vanish into obscurity. But where could he possibly go? His entire established identity, his immense wealth, and his significant social standing were intricately, permanently woven deep into the rich, fertile soil of the Willowbrook plantation. He intrinsically was the land, the grand house, and the respected family name. Without those vital, defining elements, he was nothing more than an invisible, meaningless ghost. He could frantically attempt to fiercely deny the horrifying allegations she raised. He could desperately try convincing her fragile mind that she had merely suffered a terrible, vivid nightmare. but the incredibly specific details meticulously written within her devastating letter completely proved her silent, unseen presence. It undeniably proved beyond any lingering shadow of a doubt that she had actually been standing right there in the garden, observing his most intimate, unforgivable secret in real time. His initial hot flash of useless anger quickly sputtered and died out, entirely replaced by the cold, unforgiving bedrock of absolute, terrifying truth. He was undeniably guilty of this severe, unforgivable moral crime. He had lived a despicable, consuming lie for several years, and within the rigid, deeply inflexible universe defining the antebellum South, there was absolutely zero possibility of any societal forgiveness for a monumental sin like his. He slowly walked toward Catherine's bedroom door, rapping his trembling knuckles softly against the unyielding, heavy wood. He desperately pleaded with her to listen, begging for one final opportunity to explain his actions. Her voice came radiating from the other side, sounding remarkably calm, perfectly clear, and incredibly cold, like a smooth, frozen river stone. She aggressively declared that there was absolutely nothing left to discuss, coldly informing him the damning letters were already sent. Sheriff Charles Dunwoody arrived at the sprawling Grand Estate at precisely 7:30 that morning, accompanied by two grim, silent deputies whose very dark presence immediately stained the immaculate, manicured beauty of Willowbrook. The veteran county sheriff was a rigid man carved entirely from solid oak, possessing weary old eyes that had personally witnessed every possible iteration of human wickedness the coastal lowcountry could ever manifest. He had known Edmund intimately since his early childhood, and yet here he stood, formally summoned to orchestrate the complete and total destruction of this highly prominent family name. Catherine, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying control, calmly handed him her officially signed, handwritten testimony. As he carefully read the horrifying, explicit words, his stern face visibly hardened into an impenetrable, unforgiving mask of solid granite. She coldly instructed him to formally arrest her wealthy husband waiting in his private study and to immediately place the three enslaved men down in the quarters in heavy chains. The rusty gears of brutal, inexorable Southern justice had forcefully begun to turn. In the isolated slave quarters, the horrific scene rapidly unfolded with explosive, unmitigated racial violence. The heavily armed deputies aggressively dragged Marcus, Samuel, and Daniel directly from their humble wooden cabins as their terrified, loudly weeping families watched in complete, helpless, paralyzed confusion. Cold iron shackles were brutally clamped onto their trembling wrists and ankles. Their ultimate criminal guilt was considered an absolute foregone legal conclusion under the biased law, completely sealing their bleak, horrific fate without trial. Catherine quietly requested a highly unusual, completely unprecedented private audience with the presiding judge just 2 short days before the officially scheduled public trial. Dressed entirely in severe head-to-toe restrictive widow's black clothing, she masterfully projected the deliberate theatrical image of a respectable woman violently mourning the tragic premature death of her entire future. She coldly informed the visibly unsettled judge that she had somehow discovered his highly secret, confidential sentencing plans, and she aggressively demanded a terrifying, specific modification to his proposed schedule of cruel punishments. She absolutely, fundamentally refused to allow Edmund the incredibly small, pathetic mercy of suffering alone, where he could potentially frame himself as a tragic, romantic martyr to forbidden, unspeakable love. Instead, she forcefully demanded that the 3 enslaved men be kept alive just long enough to be publicly executed simultaneously on the final, most agonizing day of Edmund's brutal physical punishment. She desperately wanted her fully disgraced husband permanently locked inside the heavy wooden pillory, violently forced to watch their inevitable choking hangings immediately after enduring his own unimaginable, skin-tearing physical torture. She deeply wanted him to painfully recognize that his selfish, depraved actions alone had placed those lethal hemp ropes directly around their fragile necks. The veteran, hardened judge was profoundly unnerved by the sheer, crystalline perfection of her absolute cruelty, accurately recognizing it as an unparalleled masterpiece of total psychological destruction. He slowly, reluctantly agreed to her horrifying, precise demands, firmly setting the bloody stage. public punishment commenced under the brutal, sweltering, and oppressive heat of the glaring summer morning sun. Edmund was violently stripped completely down to his waist and securely locked into the unyielding, rough wooden pillory located directly in the center of the bustling town square, fully exposed to the relentless, biting insects and the jeering, morbidly fascinated and cruel crowds. Catherine stood quietly watching from a perfectly calculated, respectable distance beneath her dark, protective parasol, deliberately ensuring he clearly saw her pristine, unblinking presence meticulously orchestrating his ultimate, irreversible demise. At precise high noon, the terrifying sharp crack of the strong sheriff's heavy leather whip violently sliced through the incredibly tense air, tearing deeply and mercilessly into Edmund's pale, previously unblemished flesh. By the merciful end of those first 20 brutal lashes, he was a sobbing, completely ruined physical wreck, bleeding profusely down his spine and begging incoherently for a divine mercy that would absolutely never arrive. The second day brought even more unimaginable, stomach-churning horrors as the fresh, stinging strikes fell mercilessly upon his previously shredded, newly scabbed back, rapidly transforming him into an entirely unrecognizable, bloody landscape of pure, screaming agony. He shrieked, he desperately pleaded, and he frantically called out his cold wife's name. But Catherine remained a serene, entirely unmoved statue carved from pure ice. She calmly watched the complete, violent physical deconstruction of the lying man who had nullified her very existence, utilizing his agonizing screams to meticulously rebuild her shattered pride and dominant societal standing.